Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry to jolt you right there. I wasn't expecting the mic to be that loud. My name is Brianne Roth, and I'm the Public Programs Coordinator here at the Nantucket Historical Association. And I want to welcome you all to our second Food for Thought for the Spring 2016 series. As always, we want to thank you for joining us, and we'd like to recognize that the Food for Thought program series is made possible in part by the MS Worthington Foundation, and that media sponsorship is generally provided by Novation Media. Please take a moment right now to silence your cell phones so as not to disrupt the presentation today. Please remember that we will have a Q&A at the end of this, so if you have any questions that pop into your brain during the presentation, just raise your hand at the end when we do the Q&A session, and Jacob will kindly answer the questions for you. And on to today's speaker. Jacob Horton first came to the NHA from graduate school in New York City. As an intern, he worked on the New Voices Oral History Project, still on exhibit in the Nantucket Corner. In 2015, he continued with the NHA by helping out in public programs. And this year, he returned to the research library to help further develop the oral history program. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Mr. Jacob Horton.
Hey everyone, thank you very much for coming. It's nice to see you all here. Nice, there's a few faces in the audience. I am the 2016 Oral History Fellow for the NHA, which is a great privilege for me and a very exciting adventure that I have ahead of me. And today we're fairly early in the work that I'll be doing for the NHA, and I wanted to take this opportunity that came up to work with Food for Thought, Bree, and public programs to kind of outline where we're going and the direction we're thinking about at this point. The way I'm going to do that is, one, to take you back through a couple of the early oral historians who worked on Nantucket, that we have their work housed in our archive, highlight their work, and show how we're carrying on that tradition today in the Volunteer Oral History Club that we've developed for this winter and spring season. So I'll open up briefly with some simple questions, some background. What is oral history? Why on earth is the NHA involved in it? I'm sure many of you have ideas about this already, but just so we're all on the same page, so you understand where I'm coming from on the topic. Obviously, when we look at history, what we want to do when we're building histories is build the most plausible, explanatory narrative of the past. And the best histories reference a variety of materials to try to do that, to try to draw some truth out of the events that we've gone through in the past. And oral history should be one of those sources. It's a very unique source. In what sense? Yes, it's an individual history. It's a personal narrative, the same kind of thing that we all carry with us, that story about the past, how we interpret what we've been through, weave it into a narrative, express it to others. So it's a history of an individual. But beyond that, it's also reflective of how that individual is entwined in their community. So an individual can reflect a community as well as themselves. It's sort of a twofold resource, and that's unique. So it's in my interest, and I value them as historical sources, and part of what I'd like to do is highlight the collection that we have here for researchers going forward. What is the work of oral history? It's really threefold, three areas that support each other. So you start with the research that's looking at what has been told about the past already, what has been defined in the past so far, as well as conducting new interviews. Obviously, oral history is an interview-oriented research field. And then archiving that material, responsibly preserving it, going forward for posterity, for future researchers, for descendants of the people that we interview, and for future generations on the island or anyone who might be interested in the past of this community. And then finally, the third foundation of oral history work is exhibition of some sort or another. You want to take that new research, you want to show off what you've learned, you want to examine the old research and see what it has to offer you today. So those are the three areas that I focus on, that I'll be focusing on this year: the archive, the research, and exhibition of some sort or another. Why is oral history a unique field? Why isn't it just incorporated into history? Briefly, obviously oral history predates history as we know it today as a sort of pseudoscientific, research-oriented, constructive field. It wasn't always like that. Obviously oral tradition is as old as we are as humans. But as a contemporary field, it's not possible until the early 20th century when you have recording devices, as particularly consumer-level recording devices. That's the most important aspect of oral history as it's done today. Institutionally speaking, in 1948, Mr. Alan Nevins, the historian on the screen there, starts the United States' first institutional oral history program at Columbia University. He's an American historian, interested in promoting American history as a strong academic field, which was harder in the early 20th century, much easier after the Second World War. But he establishes the first oral history program, the same one that about 10 years ago launches the master's program that I studied in at Columbia. So I very much come from the Columbia School of Oral History and their approach to that research. This is not just a shout out to my alma mater. It will come back in the story, so just stay tuned. Let's get back into Nantucket oral history now. The first oral history on Nantucket, first oral historian who sets out to do this kind of work is Henry Coffin Carlisle. Henry Coffin is born off island, but he has these strong Nantucket roots. He comes from the Coffin family. He's an 8th generation in the Tristram Coffin line. He inherits 75 Main. Famously, you probably all know, he had a museum in his attic at 75 Main built from whaling artifacts that he discovered up there. And he went through them with his contemporaries, Dr. Will Gardner and Edward Stackpole. They reviewed what he had. They constructed this museum. They invited the public in. But Henry would also invite his contemporaries up to the museum, pour them a drink, ask them, you know, you're an expert on this particular topic. Let's say it's the Nantucket Railway. We're going to do an interview about that. We're going to preserve this for the historical record. They would hash it out, he'd press record, and they do about a 15-minute interview. Very specifically focused, very topical oriented, brief, and that would be the record. But Mr. Coffin Carlisle has a very methodic approach. I do have a piece of audio that it does not sound great on this system. I didn't have a chance to test it, so what I'm going to do is play the slideshow that goes along with it as I describe his method, but I'm going to mute the audio because I don't want to hurt your ears. So Mr. Coffin recorded on phonograph records, and then he would back up on a wall and sock recorder, reel-to-reel tape, and he donated those tapes to the NHA. So he is researching from 57 to 61. And as I said, he'll invite his friends up into his attic museum and conduct these interviews. What's valuable about his work, this might be a little long for me talking over it. I think I've covered everything I want to talk about. Let's see. Let me just move to the next spot. So he would interview his contemporaries on particular topics. So, for example, Dr. Will Gardner, he talked to about the 3 bricks. Mr. Jose Reyes, he would talk to about lightship baskets and also life history. But the distilled legacy that Mr. Coffin can teach us, Mr. Carlisle, let's call him Henry, what he can teach us is to be archival minded. From the outset, he wants his interviews to go into the archive, to be part of the historical record, and he responsibly undertakes this research at the outset of every interview. He says who he is, who he's interviewing, when they are, and what they're going to talk about. Beautiful from an archival standpoint, from a researcher standpoint, because you know what you're getting into, especially with audio files. Sometimes they're quite long. Do you want to invest the time if you don't have a transcript? He's going to tell you at the beginning, and we pull that from him too. We learn that from him. And his interviews are very focused. They're topical. If he has a question, it's very specific. He asks relevant questions, and he concludes the interview, wraps it up, and that's the end of the record. That's a very particular style of interview that can be helpful for us. I was curious to know where Mr. Carlisle learned this technique, so I dug into his past, and here we go. Turns out, Mr. Carlisle graduated from Columbia University in 1910. He graduated from the mining school. He was a mining engineer. And it turns out he has another oral history collection at the very archive where I worked before I came to the NHA with his mining engineer contemporaries. Very similar in structure, but he interviews these professionals from around the world about their careers, about innovations during their career. So he has two oral history collections. One we have here at the NHA, and the other is stored at the Columbia Library. So now we understand why I brought up the Columbia connection. Let's move to our second oral historian on the island. About a decade after Mr. Carlisle passes away in 1964. We don't have anything really in the archive until the mid-70s, when we encounter Miss Mina Manor's collection. Now, Mina is similar to Mr. Carlisle in a few respects. She is born off island, but she has a deep Nantucket legacy. She also inherits, in her case, from Macy and Wagner families, and she inherits a property not on Main Street, but in Sconset, Svargaloga, on Elbow Lane. And Mina comes from this Nantucket legacy, these families, the oral tradition that we experience here on Nantucket, people talking about their family legacies. She grows up with that. She has strong ties to Nantucket, a deep wish to stay here. Eventually in the 70s, she does come to settle here for the rest of her life. She stays at Svargaloga. And she's a writer. But I learned from her daughters suffered from dyslexia. So she writes every day. She's very interested in personal narrative. She's very interested in the past. Perhaps these elements come together to inspire her to start an oral history collection in 1975. Now, Mina demonstrates to us something unique from Mr. Carlisle. There are two great counterparts in our archive that we can look to as models. I'm going to play a couple of Mina's introductory questions. So you'll see she has the same professional introduction approach that Henry did, that I referenced a moment ago. But this is just to highlight her opening volley, her opening question to all her interviews. And let's hope that the sound works out okay on this.
1975, on a pleasant morning, I'm sitting here with you in your kitchen on West Sankaty Avenue having a beer. And you are Esther Morris Swain, born April 20th, 1930. So, is that right?
That's right.
Now tell me what you can remember about old Sconset, how things have been.
Well, I went to Sconset School for 4 years, so then our teacher was Jessica
Elma Sherwin Davis, born January 26, 1910, and today's November 26, 1975. We're sitting here with you in your cozy house on Jackson Street. And I wonder if you can tell me why and when you came to Sconset as a child.
Well, I was born on Back Street in Nantucket, and when I was approximately...
Warm and cozy on a windy, nice day on November 5th, 1975, to talk about changes in Sconset.
Yeah, well, just what do you want to know first? I mean...
Well, where should we begin? What is a change that you can think of immediately on the top of your head that you like or don't like?
Well, there's been several changes since I moved to Sconset.
Today is November 24th, 1975, and I have the privilege of sitting with you, Margaret Fawcett Barnes, and your dog Burgess, 3 Traders Lane, here in Nantucket. And you say that you were born March 28th, and thank you for letting me come
At
over.
the turn of the century. I always use that because it's kind of vague and can be almost any year.
And mysterious, Margaret, too. I wanted to talk about Sconset changes, and perhaps you can tell me what is something that either pleases you over the last 50 years, or what displeases you, or perhaps breaks your heart.
It was certainly the proposed building on the Milestone Road.
Okay, so I think you get the idea that Mina has gives us a great model for community research. She has a single topic, but it's not so easily answered. She wants to know about these changes in Sconset that people are experiencing. And this is something, she's doing this in 75, this is something that the island, that Sconset, they're going to experience for the rest of the century. I mean, till today, really. So she really has her finger on the pulse of her community. And instead of asking very specific topical questions, Mina embraces the open interview format. She asks her contemporaries, tell me about essentially yourself, your experience. She's interested in the experiences, the lives of the people she's interviewing, which is it's a little more loose, but I mean it's a little warmer, it's a little more relaxed, and she gives a lot more room for people to expand and really express themselves more fully. And that's very important to us today in the Oral History Club. I ask all our interviewers to embrace the same style that Mina demonstrates. And Mina has, as I mentioned, I may have mentioned she's a writer. She wrote every single day, but she never realized her vision that she was onto with this oral history research that she did. Fortunately, she was archive-minded, was a good oral historian. She kept her tapes. We have quite a few of them at the library, which is nice. But she never realizes the exhibition aspect of her work. Fortunately, as the century wears on, she meets Nancy Newhouse, who's a local private oral historian, who is onto the same idea. 25 years later, still a salient topic in the Sconset community. And in 2004, Nancy publishes Voices of the Village, which is a lovely oral history portrait of available booksellers here. And she features Mina. Nancy conducts her own research. She references Mina's research, and she features Mina speaking about Svargaloga in the book. So it's nice that ultimately Mina's vision in 75 is realized some 25 years later. So I'm going to move on to the next collection that can teach us from the archive. And this one comes from the Nantucket High School. In 1981, there is a brief collection in 76. It's a bicentennial collection. I'm not going to talk about that. It kind of goes outside of the field of oral history into film and such. So the one that's really sort of fits much more into oral history is 1981. And that's the Nantucket experience out of Nantucket High School. A set of teachers, 3 or 4, they propose and they get through the budget arguments that always occur in the curriculum arguments sheet, and they get this class on the slate at Nantucket High School. They're going to send Nantucket students out into the community to ask questions about the past. And these kids are going to really ask questions in both directions, both in the Henry's vein, where they're going to ask very direct topical questions, but they're also going to just go out to their elders and they're going to ask a question, tell me about your life. And some of the kids really just ask that question. And so it's a nice dynamic. There's quite a few interviews over this course of 6 years. The class lasts. Their goal is that each year they're going to publish 2 journals. And they're going to take those interviews back into the classroom, turn them into articles, publish them. It's great. It turns out from 81 to 87, as with many ambitions, it looks like they only published about 5 journals, but that's fine. I mean, you aim high and you do what you can. I'm not going to play any of the audio because I wasn't sure if anyone would be as charmed by the kids' interviews as I would. And some of the qualities, there's lots of screeches, and they don't have quite the professional approach of Mina and Henry, but the core, the essence is the same thing. And there's something special about the dynamic between the kids and the adults, where the kids are willing to sit back and listen, and the adults are willing to really explain fully because they're speaking to a child. And it's a little bit of a dynamic that I'm a little envious of. It's something I try to encourage with the club today, and it's something that I like to have a little bit of in an interview. I like it if someone is willing to explain to me as if I were a child, richly. I mean, sometimes you can't afford that. Sometimes you have a very specific topic that you really got to get into. You got to cut that out. That's more the Henry approach. But when you can, when you have the time, it's nice to have the sort of the rich, open, full narrative to explore. So a couple things we can draw from the Nantucket experience that are applicable to today's group is, A, they have a team of interviewers. The class is a group. They're all on the same page. They're all going out together, and they're going to bring back information on topics that they're curious about. And then the second interesting aspect of Nantucket experience is that they're exhibit-oriented. They produce something. They bring that work. They edit it down after they do their research, and they present it to the public. They actually sold it at the Hub for a couple bucks a piece, I think. And it would be announced in the Inky every time it was out. But it's a nice model for oral history research. They went out, did the interviews, they archived them, they saved them, we have them, they edited them into a new format, and they brought it to the public. So those are the first 3 oral history collectors on the island of Nantucket as far as we have in our archive. So we start with Henry Coffin, mid-century, with the topical interview. Very important for us to understand that we can turn the interview into a focused means of gaining information. Very professional format. And then from Mina in the mid-70s, we learned how to embrace the open interview, how to value the experience, a person's, an individual's experience as an historical record, and also how to, a model for taking a single question and reaching out to the community and getting a variety of perspectives on a single question. And then the Nantucket experience, which really does both and brings them together into an exhibit format at the end. So those are the first 3 oral history projects on Nantucket. And I thank you for going along with me on that. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about how the volunteer club is structured. We're still young, but we are collecting essentially in 2 open collections. The first we call Elder Voices, and this is really legacy interviews. These are longtime Nantucketers or longtime community contributors. So I don't know if you can see the names on the screen, but it's not that important. It's just we're reaching out to people that have been involved with Nantucket for a long time, and we want to hear. Really, with them, we're going to balance the topical and the life history. We want a life history, but there are going to be specific parts of someone's life. For example, Severin's, she was a selectman, so we'd want to know about that experience in detail. It's an important community experience, but then also we want to know about her personal history. We also have the New Voices collection, which is expanded from a grant-funded project that I was brought in at the tail end of. And this is tracking the histories of the pioneers, new pioneers on Nantucket. So there's new communities that really in the last 25 years, or maybe a little longer than that, have sprouted. New connections between Nantucket and other areas of the world, direct, strong connections between very specific locations and Nantucket. And we would like to document the pioneers of those communities as well as the stories. I mean, for me, a story of transition, of crossing borders, always fascinating. So that's really the New Voices collection, focused on pioneers who are connecting Nantucket to new places in the world. As I said, we're going to combine these styles. We're going to borrow from Henry, we're going to borrow from Mina, we're going to use the open format, but we're going to take moments to really focus in on specific topics in our interview styles. So they really can be quite broad. They can cover a lot of topics. They're quite rich, whereas Henry's interviews were maybe 15 minutes long. Mine is half an hour, maybe an hour. Ours are going to be an hour, maybe 2 hours. So we really do embrace that long-form interview. How's it scheduled? Well, we all know what happens on Nantucket in the summer, so I don't want to keep anyone past the really busy time. So the time frame we targeted was really from the end of January until June. So we invited in some volunteers to an information setting. In February, we did some training. So we did some interview training, we did some recording training, and we continued to meet and workshop to try to develop our research channels and our research styles and hone them. And that's really where we're at now. Some of us are going out into the community and already conducting interviews. We're establishing a nice processing protocol so we can get the interviews in, get them online quickly with valuable information where someone could search. You can search all of our interviews really the day after they're conducted, and so far we've been able to get them up that quickly. And they're going to have a nice synopsis of what the interview's about, so they're available for researchers immediately, which is important to me. And then I'm not going to ask anybody to give any time past June, although we are delighted to establish these new relationships with volunteer members, with people who are engaged and interested in the work. It's not the kind of work that's for everyone, so we are happy that there are people who are willing to contribute, and we would hope to maintain those relationships going forward. So I do have one audio clip that I wanted to share. So one of the aspects of conducting oral history, especially in the elder voices, the people that we often talk to in elder voices, is that sometimes we lose the people that we interview. So last year I had the privilege to interview Morton and Reva Schlesinger, and we lost them at the end of last year. And they frequently came to Food for Thought, and they contributed their silversmith collection, their silver collection, to the archive here at Nantucket. That's part of what I interviewed them about. Well, I went initially to interview them about that. It turns out I got their life story, and then I came back, and then we talked about the silver. But I hope you don't mind if I share. This is a 3-minute clip, just as my way of saying thank you to them, both for their contributions to the NHA and for allowing me to come and interview them. This is the story of how they met.
So that really, I guess the end of the war, came home, and Reva will tell you how we met, which is rather interesting, I think.
Yeah. My mother was a teacher in the East Bronx. In those days, actually, that was a big promotion because they didn't ask you where you wanted to go. And her first assignment was Staten Island. So we had to move all the way down to the village so that she could get on a boat at 5 o'clock in the morning. And she was talking to another teacher. This is somewhere just about when Mort came home.
On the trolley car.
Yeah, no, but I'm saying what year it was. I would say 1945 or so.
Yeah.
And she's talking to another teacher, and a teacher in the seat in front could hear her talking, and she turned around, got up, and she said, "Was your maiden name Molly Shapiro?" Now, this was, interestingly, not her friend from earlier years, but the sister of a friend. And they lost touch. What an ear. So my mother said, "Oh, sure," and they sort of kissed and all that, and she said, "We'll be in touch." And a year or two later, the friend in Chicago's parents had a 50th wedding anniversary. And they invited my mother and father, and they said, "I gotta come too." And I said, "What do I want to go to an elderly people's party?" And my mother said, "You're going." So I went. And when we got to the party, there were only 2 teenagers, the sons of my mother's older friend. And one of them was just about my age, and the other one was like 15 or so. So the older one and I went for a walk. I mean, we were the only people there that age. So we went for a walk, and we talked and all that. And he said, "I'm going back to Chicago, but if I write to you, will you write back?" And I said, "Sure, why not?" Very nice,
Well, he was
good-looking.
going back to college.
To college?
Not in Chicago. But
In any case, he wasn't going to be in New York. So we wrote a couple of letters, and they weren't very interesting. But we still continued as friends to correspond and never went anywhere else. And one day he said to his roommate, "This girl is writing about everything you're interested in and I'm not." He said, "Why don't you take her out to dinner when you're in New York?" So he came into New York the next time, and he took me out to dinner, and we had a wonderful evening. We talked about everything we were interested in. It was a nightclub.
I don't know if it's still there.
I don't know.
Cafe Society?
And they had big stars. Jimmy Savile was there. And
Mildred Bailey was one of the
and we didn't
singers.
hear any of it. We were so busy talking. That was kind of the start of the romance.
You know, serendipity.
Yeah, it was just
if,
that my mother's friend had an ear that she could
on the
recognize
trolley car.
her sister's voice after all those years.
It's remarkable.
Very
good.
unusual.
Very unusual. So that brings us up to what did we do after we got married and went out to work.
Well, you,
Should I go on?
yeah.
I was interested in film.
So Riva does go on to tell me about her career in film. She actually was recognized with an Oscar eventually for her work on a documentary film. But thanks for listening to that with me. That gives you a little taste of what oral history research is like, what listening during oral history is like. And thank you to Morton Riva. So I'm going to leave you with this slide. This is what I go over with in the club, what I like us to do. This is our approach in brief. I want that professionalism that Mina and Henry give us at the beginning of their interviews. I want them to say who they are, where they are, when they are, and what they're talking about. And then our strategy then is going to start in the past. We're going to move toward that topic. We're going to get all of that context leading up to the topic at hand. And I think through the process, I believe, you reveal details, you reveal the processes and the routines that are going to be interesting to anyone who wants to know more about that particular topic. And that just comes out of story. That just comes out of the way that we relate our past to one another. That's how we draw meaning out of our lives. We look back and we tell stories about the past. And that's what oral history captures. So I ask all of our interviewers, all right, after you get that information out, go ahead and launch that first question. Tell me about where you were born, the people that raised you. We'll start at the beginning. So I'll leave that up on the screen, and I'm happy to take any questions if you have any. Otherwise, thank you very much for coming today.
All right, does anyone have any questions? All right, I'm going to come over to the microphone.
I'd just like to say that I'm a member of the club, and I would encourage anybody who thinks they might enjoy it to come, because Jacob provides outstanding leadership. There's nothing scary about it, and it's very rewarding.
Wow. Thank you, Peggy.
Thank you.
It's a great endorsement. She should have given this.
Does anyone have any questions for Jacob?
How many people are on your list? Do you have a huge list? Or?
Oh, yeah. Ralph asked how many people are on the list. Yeah. We probably have, I don't know, 70 people or something like that. The list is a guide, but it really grows with every interview. So every time we talk to someone new, it opens up a door for a new possibility. So it's always growing, but the list is a reference of people we do not want to forget. Either we would like to honor them and thank them by interviewing them and documenting their story, or they have histories that they're carrying around with them that we'd like to know more about. So yeah, it's a long list, always growing. All right.
So what's your most interesting one so far?
This year, for me, well, I've had two this year that I've conducted, one with Linda Loring, pretty fascinating story about joining the Red Cross and heading overseas into World War II. That was an interesting story. And I just recently conducted an interview with a gentleman from Jamaica named Ochand, and he told me some great stories, not only about the early relationship between Jamaica and Nantucket, which was important to me, but also he told me about growing up on Jamaica, and he talked a lot about the central nature of the evangelical church, but he also talked about some of the African legacy that you find on Jamaica in terms of Pocomania, which is, he says it's kind of kin to voodoo. So he told me a little bit about this, these outskirts, this outskirt traditions that he would see sometimes in his youth. So that was an interesting interview. Yeah.
And you're right, stories are everywhere. I just talked to a gentleman in Florida, 94, and he summered on Nantucket, still lives here in the summer, and he was a member of the Pacific Club. as a young man. Still, when it was a club, when old salts got together and chewed the fat, and
Yep.
many of them were related to captains. So he's got all this information, and I asked him if he would share it. He said he'd be delighted.
A lot of people are. I mean, not everyone is. And not everyone's, sometimes we try to collect videos, but a lot of people are not comfortable being on video. So a lot of our interviews end up being audio. People are real comfortable sharing if it's just an audio recording. But a lot of people are willing to share. It feels good. Yes, Ken?
What do you do with these recordings and stuff like that? How are they accessible to the public, and what's the intention in terms of how we get this community to understand the rich fabric of our history? Because that's what our mission is to tell the stories that are all about you.
Absolutely true. As Ken said, we do want, it is the NHA's mission to tell these stories and engage the community and understand how rich the community history is and how varied it is. And so my strategy, so that's the exhibition realm, which we will get to at a later point, but I do want to underline that my strategy is research and archive first, and then exhibition. And the reason for that, from my perspective, is that when we are working with other people's stories, we are, in a sense, interpreting them. We're applying our own spin to them. So it's important to me that there's an established record of the person's own voice first, so that if anyone's interested, they can compare my read to the original material. So all of our records are in the archive immediately. The full interviews, not always transcribed, but the full interviews are available online at nha.org, and you can search by collection. For example, you could search by elder voices, you could search by new voices, and you'll find a set of interviews in each. You could search by individuals' names, and the way that we're organizing, the way that we're intaking the interviews at this time, you can also search by topic, and our interviewers, like for example Peggy and Peter, they summarize their interviews as they turn them in, and so I have something to put on the record right away. So they're accessible immediately, but we haven't moved into the exhibition period yet. We're going to wait until we have a little more material to work with, and then as a group, we'll talk about what kind of themes came up, what would we like to highlight, what really stuck out to us, what do we think is really important to Nantucket right now, and that'll be sort of a third phase. Yes, Fran?
I'm sort of interested in the process of transcription. Years ago, and I can't tell you when it started, Leeds Mitchell Jr. decided he would interview John Eagle, who had come to Nantucket when he was a young man from Latvia, and John lived past 100. And the problem with that is, well, first Leeds Mitchell interviewed him, and then John got so interested in it, he bought his own cassette recorder and cassettes, and went on talking and talking and talking. But his Latvian accent is really dense. It's very difficult. I transcribed some of it, but I found it really hard going. And I don't think I would have the patience to try to transcribe all of it, as interesting as it might be. I assume you don't have anybody with quite such a dense accent among those you've collected, but what are you doing about transcription?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm a big fan of transcription. I really get a lot out of doing it personally, and I think it helps me as an interviewer to transcribe my work and others. But it is very patient work, as you said. I know exactly the interview you're talking about. It's a set of, and I'm glad that you know about it because I do have a couple questions. But maybe you have found transcription to be valuable and fascinating also, but it's not something. At first, I wanted to ask our volunteer group to do that, but I recognize how time-consuming it is, so it's kind of an open question. If someone would like to, I'm going to encourage a different type of review, where we're going to do indexing. We're going to have people listen to the interview and just put topics in a time code instead of transcribing word by word. That'll be another approach that we'll explore. But I'll probably do a lot of transcription over my year here. I think that, for example, I'll be able to transcribe all of Henry's collection because his interviews are very brief. I can do them very quickly. But minus collection would take a little bit longer because she does, as I pointed out, the more open format. In my dream world, everything is transcribed, but that's just not feasible. So if anyone is interested in even just trying their hand, we can always use a little bit of transcription. If you don't like it, at least we have that little bit that you tried out. So feel free, if you're interested in volunteering, to contact us about that. I'll be happy to get you started on that work. Thank you, Fran. Oh, right. Good point. Yeah, the audio, I should say, the audio is part of that record that goes up right away. We process it very quickly.
I'm Bill Tramposh. I should tell you a little bit about how we got to the point of having the pleasure of Jacob talking with us today, and a growing number of people volunteering to do oral histories. Under a process led by Ken Bogrand, our vice president of our board, a number of years ago, about 3 years ago now, we started a new strategic planning process. And we had, up until that point, a mission statement that was, I would say, wonderfully unforgettable. It was a whole paragraph, and nobody seemed to remember it. And basically, if you boiled that down like maple sap, you would get the core of it, which is what Ken and the board came up with, was we tell the stories of Nantucket. It's about stories. It's about whether it's a story of the Essex or the Globe or whalers long forgotten or people today. And it was becoming increasingly heartbreaking for all of us to turn around and see yet another valuable, really valuable part of this community pass away. I am so pleased that we were able to capture the voices of Morton, Riva, Schlesinger, as it turned out just months before they passed away. So it's a really important process, and we are blessed here at the NHA to have a whole list, legions of summer residents to Nantucket who really want to help as much as they can to make the community thrive year-round. I speak particularly of Robin and John Davis, who have sponsored, have endowed a position of our chief curator. But John and Robin, several years ago, decided that they wanted to help with oral histories because John really believes in that. And he said, I'd like to help, but I can't be the only supporter of it. I'll give you some money to help spawn this, and it's for the endowment. They're such generous people, like so many of our supporters, that I called them when we were about to lose Jacob and asked if we could spend a little bit of that endowment money to keep Jacob on for a year. So we're going to go a year at a time here because there's hardly anything more important that we do than to capture voices of stories of Nantucket, as we've seen from Henry Carlisle's and others. So we're very excited about it. We hope other people will join in. I want to tell you, Peter, Morrison, I'm very, very pleased with your help with diverse voices. Elder voices, diverse voices are so important to us now. And if you know people who you think we should be approaching, the larger our core is, the more we can approach. Jacob's a great trainer of oral historians. And I'd ask, as the executive director, also, if you know of people who would like to support us financially in this, we would love that. Usually there's a chuckle after that, but we're really serious because John and Robin Davis have done such a great job spawning this effort and giving us the pleasure of having Jacob on board for another year. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Bill. Thanks very much. It really is a privilege, and I hope I can help.
I'm the Peter that Bill just referred to, Peter Morrison. I just want to give you my perspective on this because I'm very enthusiastic about this. In particular, my focus has been on the new voices part. And my experience with this has been that when you start with that opening statement, tell me about where you were born and the people that raised you, to the people that I'm interviewing who come from other parts of the world, you're picking up something that we don't encounter in our lives because we don't live in neighborhoods where these people live, except on Nantucket. That's certainly been my experience. And one of the very important things to understand is that at this particular point in our history, plus or minus 10 or 15, 20 years, we have the opportunity to observe people who, from around the world, are seeking their fortunes beyond their regions of birth. They're very self-selected kinds of people, and they echo something very important about our past when you think about the history of our nation and the great westward migration and the great black migration out of the South during in the post-war period, or the pre-war period, of African Americans seeking their fortunes beyond their regions of birth. These are incredibly rich stories, and they tell a story to me about Nantucket being the scene of trials and tribulations in people's lives, but also the scenes of some terrific personal success stories. And I've been blessed just, you know, to know some of these people, and I've got a long list of folks from all over the world that I'm going to be interviewing in the weeks ahead, and it's a lot of fun. You can do it at your own convenience.
Absolutely.
And I think it's also important to recognize that what we're going to end up with in a couple of years is something that I will be very proud to see displayed during the summer to the people who come to Nantucket and say, what's going on here beside a world-class tourist destination?
Right.
We're going to have a great show to have for people who really have an interest in the place.
Thank you, Peter. We're very fortunate to have you on board. Thanks for your work.
Well, thank you all for joining us today. Let's give another robust round of applause for Jacob.
Thanks.
And if you have any other questions or anything like that, feel free to come up and talk to Jacob after this. Just as a reminder, next week we will have Billings Farm here for our Food for Thought. So they will be talking about their museum and farm in Woodstock, Vermont, so it should be a treat. And then also in March and April, we have every Saturday at Greater Light, we will have yoga at Greater Light. And you can purchase tickets for that on our website or by calling me at my number at my desk. So thank you all for coming. I look forward to seeing you next week.
Thanks, Bree.